Well, look, the fact that you are uneducated about history doesn't mean it's funny. So let me educate you now. Let me educate you now. Let me educate you now. I know that the woke narrative and the anti-Western narrative on slavery, well, you're not practicing free speech very well, are you? And we spent a tremendous amount of blood and treasure to stop it. That's the true history of slavery.
That's not what the gentleman said. There were a great number of people who were worried about what the consequences of NATO expansion would bring.
Every great civilization advances through conquest. When people talk about colonialism and complain, all I hear is losers complaining about losing.
Welcome back to Rattlesnake TV, guys. In this video, we are going to watch some key moments from Konstantin Kisin's recent Doha debate, where they discussed Western narratives and global justice. And just a disclaimer, guys, the reason why you're hearing so many English accents in this video is because it was actually filmed at the University of Bradford in England and not in Doha, Qatar. So let's get into the first bit where they discuss free speech around the world.
America in particular, and the West, I would say the transatlantic footlegs of this, are very narcissistic. We don't care, to be honest, about most of the topics you just raised, except as how they affect us. So when I love the quote that you mentioned a moment ago about history and who controls history, you have to understand history is negotiated. Most people walk around with a gauzy idea that somehow there's some real truth of history. There's not. It's a power. It's a function of power relationships that's constantly negotiated. China is renegotiating its place in the world and how it's dealt with because it's become a powerful nation. The United States is seeing its power challenge. So I just want to throw that out there. It's a much more dynamic system, and sometimes that system isn't pluralistic. Sometimes it all runs in a direction. Doesn't mean to say that there aren't other voices out there that are important, but it's very hard for them to get any oxygen.
But Steve, with all respect to you, I mean, you're describing human psychology. Human beings are prone to panics and to mass movements and delusions and whatever. But if you're challenging the young man's point about pluralism, where is this beautiful utopian pluralistic society out of the United States competitors? Are we talking about Russia or China or Gulf monarchies? Where is this beautiful pluralistic world to which we're all aspiring?
May I bring in again, our on-stage audience?
I'm joking. Yeah. No, I mean, you make a good point, but I mean, yeah,
I agree.
Great.
It's really important to recognize facts of what has been happening for decades in mainstream narrative, Western narratives. And this is where we really need to consider about counter narratives, right? We talked about how, you know, it's the West by the West, but there were so many times where counter narratives rose up, but they get silenced. And that's where power, imperialist powers put in what they do. You think of Julian Assange, and a case study that really resonates with me is Dr. Ghazan Abu Sitta, who's British-Palestinian, who saw the genocide taking place in Gaza, went back to Europe, tried to talking about it in Germany. They banned him. And then they banned him in France. They didn't allow him to talk to students. They attempted to do that virtually. If the West truly cares about what it claims to focus on, it wouldn't do that. And same happens in TV and everywhere. And we saw right now that when channels like Al Jazeera tries to have a base within the settler colony Zionist regime, it gets banned and people get silenced. And there are certain factions I can't even mention because I will be banned from this country. And that's the truth. These people are not being platformed. They have a side. They have been so stigmatized that we cannot even talk about it.
Well, I just wanted to make the point that no country has an obligation to have enemy propaganda broadcast into it. It doesn't mean they don't believe in free speech. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union did not allow the American press into the Soviet Union, and America didn't allow the Soviet press into America. It's a pretty normal thing to do because when you're at war, the aim is survival, and it's widely accepted that in a wartime things are a little bit different. But again, I put the point to you, where is this better society? Where is a society that practices free speech in the way that you'd like?
Okay, Tamim, yes.
Yeah, I think we really also need to ask ourselves who defines what that propaganda is. Right? And it's not fair because we've seen it all the time in apartheid South Africa and even segregation during the United States and so forth. A lot of these voices were shut down. There was a time, right, when the Holocaust happened, that happened for a reason because people were shut up. That propaganda was so widespread, and you're saying just because these countries were at war that somehow that justifies it. And the genocide against Gaza, is that really the war of the United States? What we could go into the obligation the United States feels towards justifying the genocide and the massacre of 40,000 Palestinians plus. It's absurd.
My point is, you're sitting here in the West and you're speaking freely. Where is the place that you think does it better than we do here?
I think it's important to recognize that this.
No, but where is the place? I mean, it's a simple question. It's just the name of a country.
I recognize the privilege I have of saying whatever I want in Qatar.
Right, so this is the best place in the world
in
for
Qatar.
speech.
I don't know. That's
no.
my personal
I
experience.
don't think anyone said that.
Like, my experience, that's true. It depends on everyone's own personal experience. In my case, that is.
Okay.
I was shut down so many times in the West. I would feel afraid. We're
So
in
why
Korea,
don't
in
you
some
go
parts of the
somewhere
United
and speak
States,
somewhere where it's better to speak?
we do a lot of these town halls in Qatar, and we say whatever we want.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just telling you.
So Qatar is better on free speech, you would say?
And what I have experienced, right? I didn't live in every single part of the world.
that's
and
because of what you're
we're
saying.
Okay, but we're not talking about Russia. Obviously, I recognize Russia has a lot of the problem, and like you said, China. But that's not the point of this town hall right now. I really would love to have a town hall focused on Russia and China and their imperialist and horrible crimes against humanity. But I think we don't have enough time for that. So let's not divert.
Would you say that Usain Bolt is fast or slow?
Sorry?
Usain Bolt, the sprinter, is he fast or is he slow?
He's fast.
How do you know? By comparing him to other people, right? The same is true about speech, the same is true of everything. Everything is understood by comparing it to others. There are 6 great civilizations in the world. Western Christian civilization, Eastern Christian civilization, the 2 Islamic civilizations, the Chinese civilization, and the Indian civilization. In which of those civilizations would you rather live than the one that you are speaking in now? That's got nothing to do with the point about speech.
Let's hold on to this, but it's good that we're getting a bit warmed up.
So if you're arguing for free speech in its purest essence, which is the ability to be able to criticize government, criticize religious ideas and leaders and form opposition to your societal institutions, then there is just no competition here. Liberal democracies in the West are much more tolerant here. Now, you may argue that big tech censorship is actually diminishing that, and that's a good argument. I mean, I've traveled to a lot of places, and I understand that when I'm in a country like Thailand, for example, you cannot badmouth the king. And if you do badmouth the king, then you're going to face about 15 years in prison or so.
This is the man who allegedly insulted the dog. It wasn't just any dog, though. It was the king's dog. And if found guilty, could face decades in jail.
Furthermore, if I go to Dubai, Saudi, Qatar, places like this, then I would keep my mouth shut about their religion because it probably wouldn't end so well for me. Although recently, when I've been in Istanbul, I have been representing Jesus by walking around the streets in my reality-based merch. And nothing bad has happened so far. And if you guys would like to get your reality-based merch, I've got my reality-based shirt on today, then head to realitybasedstore.com. We have a huge catalog of very based merch. We've got the Based and Blessed design. We've got the Unfazed Trump design. We've got some Christian shirts. We've got hoodies, mugs, posters, and everything. So you guys can scroll through the catalog below this video and also find all of the links to the store. And seeing as though it is my very own brand, guys, if you do buy something from the reality-based store, then you are helping out the channel directly to stay independent. So anyways, back to the video. I'm always puzzled by these people claiming that actually the Middle East is better on free speech than the West. I mean, if I had to steelman the case for them and try and make a better argument than they're making, it would go something like this. I would actually lean into the lesser free speech for the sake of the debate. I would point out all of the cultural degeneracy in the West. I would say that we don't have naked men walking around on the streets of our cities, and we don't have weirdos grooming children and transgenders reading the stories in our country.
Gender won't decide the choices we make. Some boys like dressing up, some girls like catching snakes.
In Canada, parents' rights are limited and children's rights are put ahead. So the child has the right to be protected from the parents when the parents behave badly.
And that is because we don't allow it. And actually, we're very strict on it, as you should be. And just as an example here, guys, I've got family who live in Dubai, and they had a bit of an altercation with the school recently where a Canadian mother, of course, had a little cross-dressing child, and they tried to make this little boy go into the female bathroom, and the school said no, and a big fight broke out. And then eventually it got to the point where the school said, sure, okay, call the police. And that was the end of the argument. So for the sake of the debate, I think that they would be better off leaning into that and challenging the notion that free speech liberal democracies are the best in the world. That would be a much, much more interesting debate. On to the next part.
I think it's interesting. We're here talking about the West, and all that we've done so far is to say where's better. I think it's diversionary. I think it's distracting. We're not talking about the entire world. We're talking about the West right now. I thought it was hilarious to see Douglas Murray on stage. It's usually hilarious when you hear Douglas Murray, but I thought it was wonderful to hear him say the West is a place where everyone's personal liberty is respected. Unless, of course, you say from the river to the sea. Unless, of course, you talk about what is happening in Gaza, and you don't frame it automatically as something that started immediately on October 7th.
I'm friends with Douglas. I've never heard him describe himself as a free speech absolutist. And as for your point about, and we saw it in the clips earlier, about you can't display a Palestine flag, I've been to several pro-Palestine protests, which are documented on our YouTube channel, with people saying whatever the hell they want, up to and including that October 7th was a false flag operation, etc. People are free to do so. I invite people to go to Russia and say that the invasion of Ukraine was a mistake or was wrong or is immoral or illegal. They will be immediately locked up. So it's not a distraction to say, where are these other societies? Everything is understood in terms of what is available to you, right? What is available to you in the spectrum of freedom, where is better than the West? That's the question.
For me, one of the great ships of Western media and journalism is the New York Times, although I can really pick it apart in a lot of things it's gotten wrong. But no, it's just my own perspective.
Sure.
But for the New York Times editor to send out a framing document on what its editors can say and write about Palestine and what they can't, as a frame through which all of their journalism must flow, is something I've never seen the New York Times apply in any other case. You could also look at the Iraq War. When you talk about government, one of the things we have to look at is governments have become very, very powerful, even in the West. I completely agree the comparison issue, but governments spend a lot of money trying to infiltrate, trying to control their own press. They did that in the Iraq War.
Sure.
We saw that with the Pentagon. So when we're talking about the erosion of what I think is a very important global asset, which is Western values and ideals that hopefully others do, they're eroding in part because of very powerful states and controls and censorship that are eroding that territory.
Just quickly, guys, if you have not liked this video, I would appreciate it if you smashed that like button. And also, if you're new here and if you feel like subscribing, then you can do so. Back to the clips.
Can I just bring in Hannah from the student audience? Thanks.
Very briefly, I just wanted to add on to some of the points that Steve raised. I think I just want to ask you to look a little bit beyond things on an individual level and questioning whether individuals are able to exercise their right to free speech in different places around the world, and look at it top down in terms of the institutions themselves and the power that they've managed to amass and the coverage they've managed to gain across the world. How are they using that responsibility to build narratives around other places in the world, considering that the West is a self-proclaimed gatekeeper of democracy, human rights, and justice? How do these values operate in their coverage of other places in the world on a mass media level, rather than looking at the question of whether individuals are able to exercise their right to free speech in the West or in other places in the world?
Well, if you're complaining about the West being powerful, I understand your complaint because the West is powerful, but I'd quite like it to stay that way because I think our values are better. But rare note of agreement with Steve. I agree with you. The New York Times has become trash, but the New York Times was always trash. The New York Times in the 1930s, while there was a deliberate famine in Ukraine committed against people like my ancestors, were whitewashing those crimes and saying that the Soviet Union was this great, brilliant society. So I've never taken them particularly seriously. And it's true. I mean, if you remember the very first thing I said, I wrote a book criticizing the direction of travel in the West, and that's an area we can agree on. I don't approve of everything the West is doing. Wokeness is a terrible mind virus that is destroying the West from the inside. I completely agree with you there. But we have to fix the West because we recognize that the very core foundation of everything that is good in the last God knows how many centuries comes from our civilization.
Well, I know there are so many hands up in the onstage audience, but let's just...
I really don't know why they're laughing at that point. I mean, there are certainly a lot of criticisms that you could have about Western societies historically and present, and they're certainly in great peril at the moment. But one must surely understand that all of the great advancement in modernity that we see at the moment, all of the great movies, art, culture, the best musicians, ideas, authors, philosophers, architecture, all stems from Christian European civilization. Even the notion that all men are created equal, which was a philosophy that in part led to the end of the slave trade in the West, these were ideas that were resisted by the rest of the world, that had hitherto been in a state of chaos and conflict, and tribalism and slavery, which, I mean, they still are in many cases. And I'm not saying that there weren't great societies built by other cultures throughout history, and there certainly were. And you might even argue that the Gulf states at the moment are having somewhat of a golden period due to their ability to be able to harness their natural resources and create wealth. But Christian Europe is the undisputed GOAT civilization. And more on that soon, but for now, let's get into the next
So
one.
my name is Adris. I'm studying biomedical and pharmaceutical sciences at Leeds University. I mean, I think everybody's obviously making great points. But Konstantin, I want to ask you about, you say how great the Western world is. So I was actually born here in the UK itself. The Western world's actually not that great because the reason being is, what about slavery? Say, for example, obviously all the innocent people that are from different ethnic minorities that are obviously being slave-driven, and their voices are not being heard. So freedom of speech really doesn't exist, I don't think, in the Western world.
What about slavery specifically?
So, and I was saying that I feel like freedom of speech doesn't exist in the Western world for everyone, because for people that are from ethnic minorities, their voices are actually not being heard. And obviously we talk about, like, obviously we talk about the Western narrative. I want to see what actually is written in the Western narrative, because I can't actually find it anywhere what the Western narrative is. So I feel like it's just made up as it goes along.
Okay, quite a lot of points there.
Well, yeah, we have to do some very quick responses.
Okay, very quick responses. So aggregating the two points that you guys made. So first of all, we should define what we're talking about when we talk about free speech. The first point about free speech is the ability to criticize the government and the society in which you live. So when I say, where is a better place to be able to criticize your government, or let's say the dominant religion, right, in that particular society. You can criticize Christianity in the West. You can criticize the British government. You can criticize the American government. And by and large, you're going to be fine. I take your point, and I made it myself about Julian Assange. As for slavery, well, if you want to go there, my friend, let's go there.
But not too far.
Well, I mean, this is a conversation that is mind-boggling to me in the West. Let's be very clear. The reason there is no slavery in the world today, I mean, there's a lot of slavery in the world today, but in the parts of the world where there's no slavery, is because the British Empire ended it. That's why there is no slavery. That is, well, look, the fact that you are uneducated about history doesn't mean it's funny. So let me educate you now. Let me educate you now. Let me educate you now. I know that the woke narrative and the anti-Western narrative on slavery, well, you're not practicing free speech very well, are you? You're not practicing free speech very well, are you? The moment I say something you don't like, you're not practicing free speech very well, are you? So
thank you.
I thought you were all about free speech. How about you let me finish my point?
Let's finish the point, and then I'm going to...
Now.
And then I will bring it to our on-stage audience.
And the anti-Western narrative on slavery is, there was no slavery, and then the British or the Americans came along and they started slavery. Slaves were the first good that were ever traded between human beings. Ever. They were the first good ever traded. Native Americans had slaves, Ottomans had slaves, Africans had slaves. Everybody had slaves. The reason there is no slavery in the West is the British Empire, having practiced slavery for a long time, like everybody else, ended it. Not only that, the British Empire then spent a tremendous amount of blood and treasure to force the Middle Eastern slave traders, with the trans-Saharan slave trade being much worse than the transatlantic slave trade.
Constantine, that is not what this gentleman said.
In terms of the number of people who were killed,
Constantine, let's just bring in Steve for a second.
In terms of how long it lasted, it was much worse. And we spent a tremendous amount of blood and treasure to stop it. That's the true history of slavery.
That's not what the gentleman said. I heard what the gentleman said.
Well, I couldn't hear him very well, so if we talk about slavery,
come in
that's
and
what we
say, I
talk
think
about.
it's very, very important what you said, because you said something that, in fact, is interesting. And this goes to an uncomfortable conversation. When you look at the rise of Donald Trump and populism in America. Why is that? Because you had a lot of people who felt threatened and demeaned and left behind in the success equation. They saw a Northeastern, mostly liberal establishment come in and screw them and basically say, you're left behind. What I heard you say is that minorities in a system that's supposedly pro-free speech, pro-civil rights, pro-democracy, they are left behind, harassed, and don't enjoy those benefits. Did I get that largely right about what you said?
You did, yeah. That's
So I just want to say that element that you talked about is driving this sense of humiliation and feeling demeaned that many communities around the world feel today is driving a lot of the hate. And what's different about the time we're in, and we're talking about journalism in part, is journalism is being asked to carry the load for that tension inside these societies when they're going through all of this. And it's very, very difficult for them to do because those societies don't often want to stick together anymore. There's a concept, civitas. You struggle vigorously. Konstantin and I can struggle vigorously, but we know at the end of the day we're on the same ship. There's mutual respect, even if we strongly disagree with each other. That is coming apart and is increasingly frayed in my country. And I got the sense from what you said quite emotionally that that's what you felt.
That's right. Yeah, that's definitely right. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the gentleman's point was actually very difficult to understand because he articulated himself very poorly. I mean, he was probably nervous and it appears as though English is not his first language. So you can understand why Konstantin went into this diatribe about slavery, which I don't know why the audience got upset because nothing that he said was untrue. But at the end of his question, this guy actually did make an interesting point, which if I perceived correctly or generously, would be an interesting one, which is that Western values are made up as they go. And what actually are Western values? What is it that we are trying to protect and that we value so much? Well, without a recognition of Christian values, the West just becomes more and more atheist. And it seems sometimes like we are just fighting to be able to do whatever we want all the time with no consequences. If the goal of liberal democracy is tolerance and diversity and anti-racism and the science and trusting the science, unless the science, of course, doesn't go with the narrative, then what you're looking at is chaos and division, which is playing out. So as much as many in the West wouldn't like to hear this, and as much as there is a lot to be proud of, we have a big problem in that our culture is in many cases lacking wisdom and lacking the ability to be able to know what is objectively good and true. And the more we just value tolerance, diversity over everything, the more we slide down this slippery slope of cultural degeneracy. So once again, still manning the point for him, which I don't even think that's what he meant, but that is the more interesting conversation here, as opposed to who stopped slavery, because we know that slavery is still happening pretty much everywhere in the world besides the West. On to the next.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Fitsum. Just one more voice, and then we're going to have to move on, unfortunately. Carry on.
Okay, thank you. My name is Fitsum. I'm originally from Ethiopia, and I'm learning at University of Bradford. I agree with what you have said, because if it is not Western, who will take global justice? I agree with that, because of this is overtaking the leadership of global power. So my question is, what about the accountability?
Accountability,
yeah, because we have seen that every global justice, what currently Western takes, depends upon their geopolitical interests. Because when the war started in the Palestine and Israel, everything forgotten about Sudan. So is it really feasible? And how can you see that?
Look, my honest view, very, very quickly, is that we should stop pretending that anyone cares about global justice. Nobody does. Civilizations pursue their own interests as best they can. If China was the most dominant country in the world, they would pursue that. If Russia was the most dominant country in the world, they would pursue their own interest. The West is pursuing its interest. And if we want to stop being hypocritical, we should stop pretending that we're acting in the interest of global justice and say simply that we're acting in the interests of our own citizens, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to be doing.
So I do agree with Konstantin here in the sense that a country's first duty isn't to international justice, and they shouldn't necessarily care about international justice if it means getting involved in foreign wars and conflict that don't necessarily affect their own people and their own national security and their own borders. However, I do think that there are ways that more successful and developed countries can elevate third world developing countries in a way that is mutually beneficial. Here are a few ways in which I think that that could happen, and I'd be interested to read your thoughts below about this. Firstly, they need to make sure things are good at home. Strong borders, strong economies, not plunging themselves into trillions of dollars of debt, strong militaries in the event that they need to use them, maximizing their natural resource production and global trade, etc. Secondly, they need to not incentivize all of the most talented people from developing countries to leave and go elsewhere, because these countries need their talent and they need ingenuity if they're going to lift themselves out of poverty. Educate your own people and emphasize excellence in your own population, rather than taking the easy way out by importing from China and India and Nigeria. Thirdly, we need to stop with the climate fanaticism and make energy cheap for the developing world, because all technology and infrastructure requires energy. Fourthly, investing in economies of those countries. For example, there are parts of Africa that are becoming AI hubs and technology hubs, and these places could see dramatic economic turnaround in the coming decades if relationships are fostered. That's a mutually beneficial business relationship. So there's a few things that could be done if you're looking to do the best thing for your own national interests, while also being concerned with developing countries as well, in a mutually beneficial way. But I'm just a retard with a YouTube channel, so who am I to say anything about anything? So on to the next bit, guys, where they discuss media bias and trust in media around the world.
Okay, so if we haven't already, I do want to roll our sleeves up and dig deeper into the role that the media plays in all of this. When it comes to trust in the media, the UK dropped to last in the survey of 28 countries, according to a 2024 report. Just 31% of people surveyed in the UK said they trusted the media to do what is right. Trust in media is also declining in the US, Germany, and Sweden.
First and foremost, I want to say there's no such thing as objective news media at all, right? That's the main mistake the mainstream media in the United States, in the West, and across the world as well. Last week, President Biden looked weak and frail in front of the entire nation. And for 3 and 4 years, the media told us President Biden was not weak and fragile. In fact, it was all cheap fakes. It was all imagination. It was all right-wing pouncing. The media hides behind objectivity to advance certain partisan objectives. I think the solution behind this is to ensure the media is open about their biases. I have more respect for Fox News and MSNBC than I do for CNN and the New York Times. Because at least I know what I'm seeing with Fox News or MSNBC. With the New York Times, they hide behind objectivity and the so-called I'm above politics. When in reality, they're not above politics. They're like everyone else. They're human beings. So I think that is the main solution behind the media. But the second, my point is about free speech and more so media pluralism. The problem about free speech and the West is that, again, FOP may make the mistake of orientalizing the West. Free speech is not the same across the entire region. The United States has much better laws on free speech than does in Europe. Here, you get fined for misgendering people. In the United States, thankfully, we have the First Amendment. But the thing is that if you decide to say that free speech is some sort of facade created by some sort of Western elite sitting somewhere in a back room trying to like, oppress other people using this oppress framework, it's just not true at all. But it is, in fact, a Western narrative that's being pushed inside the media and academia as well, alongside other sorts of narratives. And second, in terms of media pluralism, there are plenty of other news sources out there, both on the left and the right and across the world as well. There are reports on a way different a lot of things. So, for example, on the left, Jacobin, in the New Republic, for example, reports frequently on left-wing topics. Same on the right with the Daily Wire and sort of Fox News and all those sort of outlets as well. I think the best way forward for media is to be open about their political biases and to show people who they are and what they really stand for, because it makes it easier for people out there. And I'm not as cynical about people as I think the hosts here are, but I think people really want to see the truth and they want to see different perspectives and they really want to read about it. And I think we should empower people to do so by being honest and open. And that's where we're seeing institutional distrust collapse in the West, because the media is hiding behind objectivity.
So this guy actually raises a really good point here. I cannot stand news outlets that try and claim that they're objective and try and claim that they report from both sides when they're just clearly biased. And people can tell they're biased, so they should just admit it. On this channel, I'm obviously God first, Christianity first, and then my worldly politics flow from that. Whatever the political issues are that are happening, my frame of reference is the patriarchal Christian worldview. And that just happens to sit on the right wing of what we refer to as the political spectrum. I tend to think of this as the common sense, masculine, orderly, objective truth side of the spectrum. But I'm not going to sit here and act like I'm not biased, because I completely am. And you guys probably know that. Anyways, on to the next.
Can I actually put this to you, Konstantin? How do you see media bias playing out when it comes to coverage of for the Ukraine-Russian war, for example?
It takes a lot to render me speechless, as you've already observed, but I'm still speechless from that incredible graph you showed earlier where China was the most trusted media place in the world. I mean, this is hilarious, right? It's like if you went back to the Soviet Union, you would have got 100% trust in media. because the entire narrative is completely controlled. China is a country in which you can't even Google Tiananmen Square, and a whole bunch of Western apps are unavailable. The idea that we would put them on the same chart as Western countries is preposterous in and of itself. Now, as for Russia, Ukraine, as I said earlier, I from the outset have said that I think the West, or certainly the UK, which I'm a citizen of, needs to do everything it can to support the Ukrainians in their fight for their independence. However, we had a recent example with Nigel Farage, for example. I've had Nigel on my show. There's even a clip on our channel of me arguing with him about this issue. I think it's called Nigel Farage versus Russian or something like that. And he recently made comments, or rather he was asked to make comments about the whole conflict. And when he shared his view, which he's had for probably 2 decades, about NATO expansion, European Union expansion, etc., he was immediately demonized as some kind of evil pro-Putin monster, which I just thought was completely irresponsible. We have to be able to have a sensible debate about the issues. And this is why I completely agree with Steve. I wouldn't say it's a particularly Western phenomenon. I think in the West we've done more than anyone to try and overcome these moral panics, actually. But nonetheless, human psychology, mass psychosis is what it is. We do get into problems where everyone thinks the same thing. No one's allowed to disagree. No one's allowed to voice a concern.
Well, it gets back to the quote of he or she who controls the present controls the past. And it's a very, very important point, particularly on NATO expansion. There were a great number of people who were worried about what the consequences of NATO expansion would bring, and that people were looking at this as sort of a cheap way to have a rah-rah relationship in Europe, and that would be low cost. Well, our current director of the CIA in the United States, Bill Burns, a friend of mine, was our ambassador to Russia, wrote a memo in 2008 and said the expansion of NATO into Ukraine would be a neuralgic issue for the Russians. Now, Bill Burns is faithfully representing Joe Biden and the White House and all of this, but he wrote that memo. He's probably the most knowledgeable person in the U.S. government on Russia, and he was worried about this. Does that mean that you don't expand NATO? Maybe you do, but you have to be cognizant of what the costs and consequences would be from the top analysts, and that when you squelch that, you just cancel that debate. And it wasn't just Nigel Farage who was raising this. A whole squad of American foreign policy intellectuals were worried about the various dimensions of this and basically got squeezed out of the story.
Right. That was a debate we should have been able to have. And the most important thing that worries me about the way we have conversations generally is people automatically assume that you're a bad person because you have a position that they don't agree with, right? We should be able to have the sorts of robust discussions we've been having today without coming away from that thinking, well, this person disagrees with me about Israel and Palestine or Russia, Ukraine, therefore they're a bad person. What if they just have a different perspective that you don't particularly like? That's the whole point of having the ability to have these conversations.
So credit there to Konstantin for being morally and philosophically consistent, because he vehemently disagrees with people like myself who sit more on the Russian side of that conflict. However, he understands the necessity for both sides to be heard. This is consistent with his worldview when it comes to free speech, open dialogue, discussion, etc. And this topic of Russia-Ukraine played out in the most cringeworthy way in Australian media. When there was a Q&A session and somebody asked a question about the provocation of Russia and sided with the pro-Russian argument and was kicked out. Check it out.
The idea that there is a moral equivalence or there is two sides, we know that Vladimir Putin has said that there were provocations as he sought, the encroachment. Sasha, people here have been talking about family who are suffering and people are dying. And I understand you wanted to ask your question about is there some reasoning for this, but you supported what's happening, hearing that people are dying. And can I just say I'm just not comfortable with you being here. Could you please leave? I've been... It's really... No, Sasha, I'm sorry. You can ask a question. You can ask a question, but we cannot advocate violence. I should have asked you to leave then. It's been playing on my mind, and I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to leave, please.
Okay, could I...
No, please. Just out of respect. No, please, we're not having the conversation, Sasha. We can't have people advocating violence. And I should have asked you to leave. It's been playing on my mind. I wanted to have a proper conversation about these things, but I have to ask you to leave. I'm really sorry. Okay, I'm sorry for that, but you know, these things happen. It's live television. You think about these things. It's really been troubling me that we can have a conversation and we can look at where the arguments are and we can try to look at the sides of the argument. We can't have that, and I'm sorry.
Australian media, ladies and gentlemen. Now onto the last bit about the West and capitalism.
Okay, can I bring in our onstage audience? Abdurrahman first.
Thank you so much. It's a great chance to ask this question. So, being lived in 5 countries and traveling to more than 10 countries in my lifetime, I've noticed that, so we say that the West might have developed very fast because of its values that are great, but I have a small question here to see. Most of the countries I visited, which were meant to be full of resources, somehow had bad management. And some of the countries that they seem to be known for having little resources, had better management in them. So things like the internet and cars actually came because of wars. What are the chances that the West advanced because of some lacks in resources and because of the colonization that happened, and because in some of the global South countries they still think the third world and the first world is actually a ranking instead of whether you are following the West or the SU back when the Second World War was happening. So what are the chances that the reason why free speech is not being applied well in other governments is because the way the government is being run is not in line with the values of that country's people itself?
May I make just a very quick point just on your point? I'm not going to be able to cover all of your question, but I just wanted to pick on something you said. We hear this conversation about colonialism a lot now, especially in the West. The sad truth of the world is that every great empire and every great civilization was created through conquest. If you look at Russia on the map, it's the biggest country in the world. That didn't happen by holding hands and singing Kumbaya. I studied Islamic history when I was at university. The great successes of the caliphate in its early days were not achieved through holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Every great civilization advances through conquest. When people talk about colonialism and complain, all I hear is losers complaining about losing.
So that was not a complaint. I see that something happened again.
I don't mean you specifically. I mean just this whole narrative about colonialism.
The point is, the only word you heard from my friend was slavery, and the only word you heard from me was colonialism. My question was, and it's
well, as I said, your question is long and complicated.
I'll simplify it. It's okay.
So if your point was we create a lot of the things that we created through war, and many of our achievements were developed through that. My point to you is all of human achievements were created through that to some extent.
Absolutely. My question was, we are saying, we're all talking about Western narrative, not because we're trying to pick the best place and then we all can go live in. I think we're trying to find the way to advance the narrative in the world to the better for everybody as much as we can, if that's possible.
I think it is, so.
Okay. So my question was, the value, you first say that everybody's following their interests, but then you say, I think the West values are the best. So is it morals and values, or is it interest? I want to know. And is it because the other countries like Jordan, where they try to follow the Western narrative, and as much as prices are the same as in UK, but salaries are not even third, is that because the values of the people are different from the values of the system that they are following?
No, I don't think it's because of that. Obviously, different countries have different resources and different histories and different geographical positions and different neighbors, etc. When I say every country and every civilization pursues its own interests, that's just a statement of fact. But in terms of values, the reason I say Western values are better is the West is the only place that the idea of government by consent, the idea of freedom of the individual, the idea of free market capitalism, and the idea that we should all be free to pursue our own interests as we see them fit is even considered a value. That, to me, is the reason for our success. Now, of course, the United States is not only successful because of their ideas, it's successful because it has a geographical monopoly on a continent. It's able to be completely free from invasion. It's a newly created country that was able to build infrastructure from scratch, and on and on and on and on we can go, right? But ultimately, what I'm saying is the values, the reason billions of people have been lifted out of poverty around the world, you've got to think about this, right? In 1947, when the partition of India happened, the average life expectancy in India was 32. 32. Right. Today, it's over 70, and the reason is because of capitalism, and capitalism was created right here in England. You should look it up, sir. You should look it up.
So the questions here are complicated ones, and Konstantin is vastly outnumbered. I mean, I don't think that there's anybody else on this stage who actually really agrees with him. And that's curious because, like I said at the start, this is held in Bradford and not Doha. And they're trying to call him out for only noticing what he wants to notice. But in a situation like this, when you're outnumbered in a debate, you do have to be very conscious about the framing of the conversation. And there are certain topics here which Konstantin would actually be very confident in. So, I mean, from a debate perspective, it's well played. He wasn't necessarily avoiding anything, but just managing the direction and the frame of the conversation. And actually, I think that the rest of the guys on the panel and ladies on the panel did a pretty poor job of this, which is why I had to steelman their arguments for them at times. So, anyways, guys, with that, enough from me. Do not forget to check out the reality-based store if you haven't already. And also, if you would like to shop the catalog, it's just below. My links will also be below for social medias. Subscribe to the channel here if you haven't already. And also, if you want to watch another one, right here. Till next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.